All right. Well, I think we'll go ahead and kick it off. My name is Blake Hall. I'm the co-founder and CEO of ID.me, and I'll be moderating this particular panel. We're going to be talking about some of the demographic challenges that are involved with establishing someone's identity online. As most of us know, it's not a monolithic challenge. Verifying a senior is not the same as verifying a millennial. Verifying someone in the developed world is not the same as verifying someone's identity in the developing world. And we've got a really great group of panelists today. Fairly ambitious schedule of questions and things like that. But my goal is to really create a conversation. I want to open it up for Q&A from the audience at the end so that we get some good dialogue and participation. But first, going to give each of the panelists a minute or so to talk about themselves and their backgrounds and what they're working on as it relates to this discussion. And I'll start here with Katie.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Katie Hyatt, and I work for FHI 360's MSTAR project. So MSTAR is the Mobile Solutions Technical Assistance and Research project, and we look at 3 streams of work. So digital financial inclusion, digital financial services, digital inclusion, and development informatics. And so with our work, my work is very focused on access to digital finances, particularly looking at women's access to mobile, women's access to more traditional financial instruments. And we're really very aware of the barrier of identity and women being able to use these products and services. So that's really the angle that I'll be coming from.
Terrific, thanks.
My name is Claire Roberts, and I'm the VP of Risk and Compliance for Marqeta. Marqeta is a payment processor program manager in the prepaid and credit space. We're based in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I focus on my piece of identity verification is all about KYC, CIP for customers who want to have fairly traditional type of financial services products. And as Blake pointed out, the difference between somebody who's 50 and well-established versus somebody who's 19 and maybe has never lived anywhere but mom and dad's house. So those are I'll be coming at it from some of those perspectives.
I'm Jim Barnett. I do competitive intelligence at AARP, and we really come into the space from 2 perspectives. First and foremost is social mission. Strong, trusted identities are just incredibly important going forward, not just for the 50 plus, but for everybody. We all need these consumer protections that are involved in trusted identities. Also, we look at it from the standpoint of consumer experience or member experience, and what can we do to help our members navigate just this world of abundance we have now on the internet and do it in a safe way.
Hi, I'm Tracy Hulver. I, full disclosure, work for Blake at ID.me. Nothing like having your CEO.
No pressure.
Yeah, exactly. Be the moderator. But I lead the federal business development team at ID.me, where we focus on identity verification, federation of that identity, and then strong authentication across a wide range of demographics, basically citizens. We're one of 4 federally accredited through GSA providers of strong identities, and hopefully we'll bring kind of a bunch of wide issues to this discussion today.
Terrific. And so before we kind of zoom out and talk about some of the challenges in the space, I think it's important to really ground the discussion in a specific example of how some of these issues actually impact people. And Tracy, there's a project that you had worked on where physicians were having some difficulty with authentication, and it'd be great if you could maybe shine some more light on that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So in a previous life, we had an identity verification process. And when you think of challenges with identity proofing populations, some of the conversations or comments have already been made. You think of thin files, you think of millennials, you think of the elderly that may not grasp technology. But we found it a challenge also with people that have a lot of information about them readily available, primarily physicians. And what we found was that you can't, just because you might have deep information available about a particular population, doesn't mean that that population is going to find it easy to become identity proofed remotely. So the two examples that we used with the physicians, one was something as simple as during the process clarifying what the address that we were requesting that they enter was, because the physicians were entering their address of their hospital or their medical offices, couldn't get identity proofed. And these were people that were trying to issue e-prescriptions to meet meaningful use. So this was not maybe life and death, but it was critical. So that was a challenge and shows how ease of use and making sure that you walk the person through exactly what you're expecting of them. The second issue, and I hope there's no physicians in the audience, but that we find challenging is physicians delegate a lot. They delegate to their RNs, they delegate to their PAs. So a lot of the physicians that were calling us saying, I cannot become identity proofed, what we found out were they were having their PAs walk through the identity credentialing process. The PAs would then get to, our primary method was KBAs. They would get to the knowledge-based assessment. Some of them would know some of the questions, but a lot of them would just exit out of the process, but that would count as an attempt. So they were getting locked out of their the credit checks and things because people were failing out of it. So it just goes to show that understanding not only the data that's available with the population, but also understand how these people need to get credentialed and the importance of it becomes very, very challenging sometimes.
Thanks for that. Really appreciate it. And so I think now we'll zoom out, open it up to the panel, and the question is, what are some of the biggest challenges and maybe opportunities that you're working to solve today?
Well, I think that there are sort of limitless opportunities in terms of where this could go. Certainly, from my perspective, working at an NGO, we sort of see access to healthcare, education, financial tools as being fairly life-changing. The challenges are also are very big. I think that the biggest, from my perspective of I'm just trying to understand the user experience and what this is actually going to look like when it trickles down to the person who's actually suddenly has an identity. Is what does that identity mean to them? And lots of people have touched on that today, the GSMA and Caribou in earlier sessions. But what is the value of an identity? If you've never had an identity and you've never really needed one, you've been in a rural village, and then suddenly you have to have an identity, and you're given a 12-digit number. What does that, how does that improve your life? And I think that we don't necessarily understand. Well, I don't think we understand that at all, and it's certainly there's not one size fits all. It's going to be very different for every person. But until the user understands that and understands that there is in fact a tangible benefit, so it's our role to really highlight what that is or to understand what that is for the community. It's going to have it's going to be very difficult to get to any sizable uptake, and it's just going to be sort of another add-on.
So mostly for identity in the developing world, I take it. If somebody hasn't,
yeah.
Oh no, it's fine. I just think it's important to frame. And then for the educational component, have there been examples of programs that were effective where there was maybe a turnaround from how the program initially was received to some educational efforts that were successful?
Well, we've done some work in Liberia. So we're working with the government of Liberia to pay teachers through mobile money, and part of that has been working with the government to ensure that they have identities. So we this was about 3 years ago. Before I arrived. But looking at, we had basic biometric readers. And we went out and worked with communities to help them understand that if one of the reason for the program was that the teachers were missing a lot of school because they were traveling 9-10 hours to get their salaries from the bank.
Wow.
And so by when mobile money came about, and we were able to then leverage that agent network, we had to ensure though that there was the right people were getting the payments. So that's something, that's not so much accessing education, but it's improving the educational ecosystem.
And was the government involved with that program at all, or was this something that the market and maybe the mobile network operators took lead on as far as delivering these services to teachers and students?
It's definitely, the government was certainly involved, the Ministry of Education. That was where the money was coming from for the teachers' salaries. But the sort of the rest of the puzzle was, it's funded through a USAID mission in Monrovia, and FHI 360 and the mobile operator. But of course, you need to ensure that the agent network exists and can identify people appropriately as well. So there's a lot of capacity understanding and then capacity building.
Right. Claire?
So Marqeta works with a lot of startups in our part of the world out in the San Francisco Bay Area who are looking at different ways to deliver traditional financial services or alternative financial services to different demographics. And sometimes the different demographic that need the financial services are the ones that are the hardest to use the traditional ways of doing identity verification. Plus, we're also trying to get them in large part to enter information on mobile devices. So how do I get people, back to the point that was made by, I think, Tracy, how do I get them to give me their legal name? I never really thought that was too much of an issue. I've been doing this for a long time, but recently, one of our customers, their demographic is 25 to 40-year-old professional women. And these women have multiple names. They maybe use their maiden name professionally, and then they use their maybe married name, with their kids. And when we tell them to put their legal name in, they put in whatever name they're thinking about that at that moment, and then it doesn't match their social security number. So then they're like, well, how can I'm not verifying? Or we do also work with a lot of businesses where they put in their business address instead of their home address. So they're perfectly legitimate people but we aren't able to use some of the automated ways. And a lot of our clients are looking very much at the customer experience. They want this to be something that's easy to do. They want it to be something that's seamless and that only takes a few moments to be completed. And when we have differences in the information that we're receiving, or it's a demographic maybe where they have a thin file, or they're new to the country, or they don't have a social security number, then because we're working with financial institutions, it becomes a hurdle for us to figure out alternatives that can meet the federal banking regulations and all of the increased scrutiny that's coming, that our banks are getting from their regulators, but still be able to meet the innovative, exciting new technology and great new experience that our customers are looking for.
So do you think, is it more of a usability and messaging issue with getting consumers to enter the right data, or is it more on the back end that the data providers should have maybe that this identity's maiden name is also tied to this social security number, and there's also a married name that's tied to it? Do you have a perspective on that?
I think there's a couple different pieces. One, it's explaining it to the customer when they're looking at a screen, that's this big, and you're trying to get enough information on the screen without having them have to go through screen after screen to enter their information. I think that some of it is that the rules, some of the identity providers can provide me with that flexibility, but because of the regulatory scrutiny that my banks are getting, I have to set the rules pretty tight, and somebody's Bill versus William might work. But then again, and I may be able to pull up a report manually that shows where I can see both last names or an alternative address. But because of the regulatory scrutiny that my banks are getting, I've had to ratchet those rules down pretty tight. So it does require that extra manual step, which, as I said, isn't the greatest customer experience and isn't really what some of these, innovative payments companies are looking for.
So it sounds like part of the challenge is just consistent regulatory framework and adjudication of things that are out there. Is that maybe more because there are different entities that are responsible for the regulation, or is it specific to the actual regulator that's dealing with the bank?
No, the regulators are becoming more and more consistent. But it would be great if we could, as we continue to have dialogue with them, if we could look at alternative ways to validate identity other than the traditional ways that we've always done it, and that that regulatory speed of change doesn't move very fast, at least in my experience. And also, there's lots of other pressures. There's lots of pressures to make sure that we do know who people are and that we aren't, moving money for illicit purposes and all of those things, which are, real concerns. And how do we find a balance? And just trying to strike the balance there.
Yep, government moving faster. That's probably a theme everywhere. Jim?
I would agree with the first comment that the possibilities really are limitless, and that's what's kind of daunting about this area. And AARP, as a legacy organization, is really just waking up to those possibilities, which is very exciting. But one of the things we have to work on is really defining our value proposition. So when we think about the verticals in which we operate, which we sort of shorthand as health, wealth, and self, as in self-fulfillment, they're really different. So, for example, in the health area, very much like you were saying previously about doctors, in the caregiving use case, we have people who are adult caregivers for their parents, and they have huge identity challenges. I remember in my own case, when my mother, in her declining years, I had to log on to the bank as her. I had her power of attorney, but there was no way for me to identify to the bank that this is Jim logging on for Kay. And that's the kind of thing we want to solve. I think about jobs, and work. We have our members are professionals, so they've got certifications, those kind of things they want to use. Also, they're investors, they're savers, and then also if you look in the self-fulfillment, people want to travel, they want to have fun. So that's where the value proposition is more about the experience you can create using trusted identities as opposed to sort of locking down your data. So it really runs the gamut, and as we're standing up our own ideas, we have to think about them in very sort of discrete ways.
Yeah, it's interesting that delegated access is a theme that's coming up both for physicians and for seniors as
Absolutely.
well. And I know that caregiving is an area that you guys have focused in as well. Have there been any specific challenges that have come up in in-home caregiving that you're tackling?
We're still kind of sounding that out right now. As far as the identity work goes, we're not quite there yet. We have a large caregiving initiative, and it's largely around education right now. So I think one of the things we want to talk about here is how important education is, and that's where we're hoping to really make a difference, is to help educate our members about how to manage their identities. And so there's our Fraud Watch network that really helps with that, but it's more of a traditional sort of educational outreach.
Yep. Tracy?
Well, I think from the biggest challenges that we're facing is with the citizen to government access, and that government could be state or federal or some other country. The challenges the government is facing is kind of twofold. One is they've got a huge attack surface, right? In fact, the Federal Trade Commission last year came out, and of the 15.7 million identities that were stolen for identity fraud, 49% of those were used for some type of government document or benefits fraud. So when you think of somebody stealing an identity, you think, well, they're going to try to get to my credit card or they're going to try to get to my bank, which is true, but the first place they go is to try to do some type of fraud to the government. So the attack surface is huge. At the same time, they're trying to, with AARP as an example, your user population is very specific. Not that it's easy, but it's kind of a specific demographic. The government runs the gamut. If you're a citizen of the state or if you're a citizen of the federal government, you can use government services for benefits and other areas. And the challenge is that as the government budgets get cut, as more and more headcount, we just went through the beginning of the year with a headcount freeze with the government. One way to solve that is to open up more services and benefits online. But how do you do that to make sure that the person that's sitting on the other end is actually the person not only that they're claiming to be, but also that they're authorized and approved to do whatever the transaction is. So it's a lot of unique challenges that they're facing, and I think that one of the things that you have to start looking at is you can't rely on one authoritative source to pull that identity verification. You have to look at a lot of different unique and innovative ways to prove that that individual is who they're claiming to be, and subsequently that they're authorized to do whatever the transaction is that they're attempting to do.
Right. I think the 49% statistic is pretty compelling. According to paymentAccuracy.gov, the federal government here in the United States made $137 billion of improper payments last fiscal year, which is just an unbelievable number if you really think about it. And I think that's a good segue into maybe government data breaches to talk about multi-factor authentication. So the Opm breach, which compromised the national security personnel of the United States, that happened through an administrator's breach password, single-factor authentication. Anthem Healthcare, which breached 78.8 million Americans' names, date of birth, and social security number, also happened through a single breach password for an administrator. We live in a world where Yahoo reported, I think now over a billion plus breach logins. LinkedIn had several 100 million breached logins. And so even if you get the identity right for the demographic, consumers are increasingly being asked to set up multi-factor authentication so that they have more than just a password that protects their login. How does access to devices impact the demographic challenges of meeting some of these new standards as passwords are breached more and more at scale? That's open to anyone.
Well, Blake, we were talking before the panel about biometrics, and so there was an article, I think it was the American Banker, we were trying to remember, from a couple of years ago. They looked at how do older people use biometrics versus millennials, and there's really no difference in adoption. It was pretty much the same across the board, is what they found. So to me, that's very encouraging, because it's the kind of thing where it would be an aid to people who may not have a lot of different kinds of devices, or want to think about that kind of thing. But if they want to be able to use their face or their voice, that's a big plus, I think.
I agree. And I think one of the things that we focus on at IDMe that we've run into is that if somebody has a smartphone, you can do biometrics securely through that client-side device. But right now, biometrics through a browser and through a laptop or desktop are not secure, unfortunately. And so what do you do about the population of folks who are out there who might not have a smartphone or might not be computer literate enough to use it? Would be open to any comments on that?
Well, I think that the key, the data, the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, which is published yearly, had a very interesting statistic in it. Of the billion or so records that they investigated that were breached, and it wasn't only Verizon, it was the U.S. Secret Service, CERT, other partners, over 50 partners contributed to the data set. Over 65% of those data breaches were a result of a weakened credential. That meant that it was either stolen, it was brute forced, something happened that they got access to the system through that attack vector and then installed malware or whatever the next level attack was. Of the 67%, none were a result of a breach of second factor. So that goes to show that when I add that second factor on top of the knowledge-based factor, the username, password, or PIN, whether it's a biometric, whether it's a possession of a smartphone or something else, the security of that ecosystem goes up exponentially. But you can't limit it to one thing. Some people are going to want to choose biometrics. Some people are going to want to choose one-time passwords through their mobile device. Some people may just want to use geolocation. If my phone is within 3 feet of the workstation that I'm attempting to do the transaction, maybe that's sufficient. So you get more into risk scoring and probabilities than you do into a binary yes or no, like a password or PIN is. So our approach is give the user choice, but whatever you do, you have to enforce or certainly strongly suggest using some form of multi-factor. And the last thing I'll say is multi-factor with security questions isn't really the way to go, but something else that either you are or something that you're in possession of.
Yeah, thanks for that comment. It's a really difficult. We'll go here to Q&A in a moment. I just want to make a comment that if you don't have a smartphone, there are things out there like YubiKeys. I know that Stina from Yubico is running around out here, security keys that might be more accessible from a cost standpoint than buying a smartphone. But there's an enormous consumer education problem about why you would need that. And there are folks who are not going to be happy about having to add that layer of security onto their account, even though it's the best thing for them. Social Security got inundated with tens of millions of complaints when they just tried to do basic SMS two-factor authentication on their accounts. And I know that that was a really tough challenge they were grappling with, which is that I want to increase the security to protect the sensitive data of citizens. But if I do this, it could preclude access for a large number of people who don't understand or don't want to actually go through some of these steps, which I found myself empathizing with that team a lot because they were getting beat up. We had a question here, and I'm quite happy to take questions from the audience so that we can open this thing up. The mic's right there in the middle if you could ask there.
Listening at what you're saying, the use of a second factor increases exponentially the security of your application. Have you considered or are you using or planning to use behavioral biometrics as a second factor? Because adding a second factor also carries the risk of knowing that second factor. How do you generate the token you need to access? And with behavioral biometrics, it's basically taken from the users or the human essence that you have as a user, and you don't have a way in implementing that solution. So the question is, have you used or are planning to use, or did you make any research about behavioral biometrics?
Yeah, I'll take that. So I think that the key is, number one, it's good that whatever the second factor is, it's something other than a knowledge-based question, mother's maiden name or your high school, right, which we all know is easily breached. Biometrics or behavioral analytics, they're now coming to fruition, especially if you look at some of the technologies that are being built onto the smart devices. And yeah, I think that our view is that the more inputs you can have into that second factor, of course, there's a point of diminishing return, but the more you can get a confidence score up, maybe that's through a combination of things. Maybe you're not presenting the user with a second factor challenge at all because you're doing things in the background that are getting the security score up. So you may be looking at your geolocation, the device fingerprint that it's coming from, and the behavior of what you've baselined that against. All three of those things could come and meet, possibly, depending on the security required for the transaction, that second factor, and the user's not doing anything. And to Blake's point, I think that we all know that second factor is needed, but when you're dealing, especially back to AARP or back to some of the other challenges you have, as soon as you put that extra step, now you've got a challenge of, okay, you're going to have help desk calls. I know retailers are very concerned with shopping cart abandonment. So yeah, behavior analytics are certainly something that we're looking into. And as they come to more fruition and more options, then yes, you would use that in your confidence or risk score.
Anybody want to add to that at all, or?
I just agree. I think as far as that trade-off goes between convenience and security, people don't want to think about, don't want to have to think about it. They want to be able to get done what they want to do, and that's what the market is going to command. Is like, how can we make this as secure as possible, but also as easy as possible, and create those really, really enjoyable consumer experiences or member experiences.
I think go ahead.
And I think the other point is that it's an education. There has to be a lot of education because we're back to usability. We want this. We want everything to be instant. And, I'm going to have to wait for a few seconds to get that text message with that code in it. I'm going to have to do something else. And people are moving fast, and they have to understand that this few seconds that they're going to spend is really there to protect them. And so I think there's a huge education component, and not only with older people, but who may have other challenges as well with technology, but younger people who just don't don't get it and think that, well, if something goes wrong with the transaction, I'll just call and they'll just give me my money back. Well, at some point that may not work. And so I think the education piece is important, that everybody understand the importance of identity protection and identity verification.
Completely agree. I think one of the things that's interesting too is just around standards. We're used to passwords and even like YubiKeys, which is cryptography. It's deterministic, whether it's an exact match or not. Biometrics is all about probability. And so whether it's a behavioral biometric or heuristic, standardizing it against things like Touch ID and against facial recognition, against voice, is a really thorny challenge too. I think there are great bodies like the FIDO Alliance that are starting to work towards that. But anybody who's been to an RSA conference knows there's a ton of vaporware that's out there as well. So sometimes there's like a wheat and the chaff problem to know if a particular technique is actually matured to the point where it's actually ready for deployment at scale. But completely agree. I think it's a matter of education and choice. There's probably a small percentage of folks who would actually like know that they're sort of being invisibly authenticated in the background. There might be some people who are just freaked out that they're able to like go right into financial services or something like that without actually feeling that they were authenticated. So there would be a pretty strong need for consumer education, in my point of view. Katie, did you want to jump in on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add really that, I mean, the consumer education piece is just so important, and it's going to look so different in rural India to San Francisco, but it's one of those things that, one size does not fit all. It requires a huge amount of research. If you don't understand the lie of the land, you're not going to be able to develop any kind of appropriate materials. I think it was, I was in India a few months ago, and we were meeting with a group of women who made garments as part of a larger organization. Now, over 1 billion Indians have Aadhaar now, and when the question was asked to the room, who has an Aadhaar? Everyone put their hand up. And who has a bank account that's attached to their Aadhaar account? Everyone put their hand up. Who uses their bank account? One person. And this is a room of 40 people. And when asked, what do you do with your money? They said, we use a ROSCA, a rotating savings club, a chit fund. And they trust it. They understand how it works. They know where the money is. The money is tangible. It actually sits in a locked drawer. And that for them is much, much safer, because why would they give someone they don't know, someone with authority, their money? And I think that just sort of really says how we need to stop making assumptions as to, what would be beneficial. The idea that, credit is great for some people, but we can't assume that if we're talking about economic identities, that credit is going to be the sort of the hook that gets them on board. Credit is a nightmare for many people.
Right. It almost reminds me of stories. My grandparents who lived through the Great Depression would tell me that they lost confidence in the financial sector, and so they would actually keep their cash at home and underneath their mattress. Do you think it's more like a lack of trust in the government or the system, or it's just that their habits are so ingrained about the way that they've done things that it just makes it very difficult to move? And if you guys didn't get that far, that's fine. I'm just curious.
No. I guess from previous work, I can definitely say that it's in my experience, thinking of work I've done in Papua New Guinea, it's definitely a combination. You're dealing with the rural poor. These people are the most disenfranchised. They haven't necessarily been looked after by the government. So what they have in front of them is all they have. So if they can't see it, if they're being told, go and put your money in a bank account, give it to someone else. We're making a huge number of leaps there as to, what people's behaviors are, what their assumptions are, their confidence in the system, be it, mobile money or Aadhaar, or what does it actually mean for them?
Right. And while we're on this topic of sort of new techniques, because I know, Claire, you've talked about the intersection of innovative techniques for account opening and things like that in the midst of an increasingly aggressive regulatory environment. What are you seeing in the financial services sector as far as opening up financial services to new groups?
Well, it's tough, and as I said earlier, it's trying to find that balance, and it's trying to work through and determine how can we start. So what we started doing is using some new tools, sort of in the fraud monitoring area, to kind of help build a track record with them, because it's really hard to say, hey, look, I've got this, great new tool, but nobody's ever tried it before, and it's kind of one of those things where nobody wants to be first. And so, but on the innovation side, we do want to be first, but on the practical regulatory compliance side, nobody wants to take a chance of getting their hands slapped because we weren't using something that was tried and true. So we've added it on as additional and over and above, what our existing protocols are, so that we can test it to see what kind of results we get. It does make it a higher level of burden, and it does make it very sometimes not cost effective to be able to do it, but it's what you've got to do to be able to build a track record for some of these new tools, so that we can look at other options. Now that there's synthetic identities and lots of talk about that, and how people can use other ways to build identities, and it's a hard nut to crack, but it's something that we're always looking at, especially as we continue to work with innovators and want to make financial markets open to people who haven't had them open to them before. I think it's the same thing. It's the flip side of consumer education, in the sense that it's making sure that everybody understands, because it's hard to trust something when you don't understand it.
Yeah, it seems like things are very reactive right now instead of a proactive regulatory framework that would help innovation. Does anybody else want to get in? Then I'm going to open up.
Oh, just to add to that, I think a lot of organizations are conflicted about how to proceed on this, because on the one hand, you see the possibilities and what you can do for people and for consumers, make their lives better. But by the same token, you don't want to break that trust. I mean, once that trust is broken, it's broken forever. So we take that very seriously. We don't want to do anything, offer our members anything that we can't put ourselves behind 1,000%. So I think that is why we haven't seen that big hockey stick of adoption, around some of these federated, level 3 federated credentials, because we want to be careful. And, the kind of headlines we had today, you don't want to be in that headline, right? So,
Yes, timely comment for sure. It is a little bit of better the devil you know than the devil you don't, that people are very comfortable with how they're being taken advantage of today. And there is always inherent risk with trying new techniques. So definitely government and financial services are more risk averse partners and customers, and it takes a lot of time to build relationships. AARP too. but with that, I think we'll open it up for questions from the audience, that we can bring some other voices into the conversation.
Yes. Excuse me. My name is Sheree Mitchell. I have a question in terms of, as we're talking about demographics, are we looking at threat modeling as an aspect of this in terms of demographics? So, for example, as you brought up women being, because of their last names, that they may not be able to have identity, but also in the sense of their IDs being attacked because they are women and or women of color, or whatever demographic they come from, or whatever country or culture that they come from, that can be different in terms of how they may have their identity breached.
I think that's one of the reasons why there's reluctance there's reluctance to adopt some of the new alternatives, is because we want to be sure that we always want to be sure. The goal in the end, it's certainly in my part of the world, as was said, is that we have to be trusted. It has to be something that people have confidence in, and the bar is high for a reason. And so we have to be very careful when we approach new options to make sure that we aren't letting nefarious people in who are trying to do bad things to people, and since everybody who signs up for my programs is signing up online, are they able to take advantage of older people or people who don't understand the system well enough, because they'll give them information because maybe it's somebody that they do trust or somebody who can take advantage of them. So I think that's where we're trying to strike a balance in terms of being able to be open to the broadest group that we can, but also trying to protect the people who need to be protected the most. And that may not be exactly answering your question, but it's definitely a fine line that I walk all the time, because I want to make it easier, but I don't want to make it too easy, or there's a certain level of complexity that It sort of comes along with it. And if I make it too simple, then I can't allow people, inadvertently, I can't allow people to be taken advantage of. And that would be something we don't want to let happen.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I just had one quick comment. I think for threat modeling, one of the hardest challenges is authentication through call centers. And typically, we talked a lot about education. That's what consumers are going to go to if they're having difficulty. And malicious actors have just gravitated to call centers as a way to breach someone's identity, because customer service and call centers are exactly about that. They're about helping that caller achieve their objective, not about fraud prevention. So we think that the ideal system would separate the authentication of identity from that customer service representative so that they're not caught in the dual role of fraud prevention and customer service. And unfortunately, a lot of the folks who need education and help the most are therefore the ones who are at risk of breach, because that rep, maybe with a tape of a baby crying in the background and things like that, might give a malicious actor access to someone's account. Brian Krebs, the security researcher, wrote a great post about how his PayPal account was hacked by an ISIS hacker who got access, and he knew it had to be the call center because he was using cryptographically generated passwords from password managers. And the way that he recovered his identity, ironically, was by sending an image of his driver's license and calling the same call center to restore access to his account that the ISIS hacker had used to get access to his account in the first place. This is just a circular thing. So I thought that was a relevant example that might tie into some of the threat modeling for a specific group. And then Jim, you had a
I was just going to say, in the reading I've done on this, I think if you're asking sort of, what demographics are at greatest risk, that's sort of the cutting edge of research right now, from what I understand. I know our friends at Center for Identity at University of Texas are doing that kind of modeling, so that might be a resource. We don't do it at AARP, but of course we're interested in that same question as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I heard earlier today, one of the earlier talks, someone said, if the government said that we should all have retina scans to travel, we'd have an outcry. But if we say you can go in that line if you don't get one, but you get that line, the pre-check if you do. Now I hesitate to use the word incentive, because it's the dark side of that is creating second-class citizens. Because pretty soon that slow line is going to have one person at the other end, and the pre-check line will have everybody else. So there is another side to it. But the idea is the same with the banking too. I mean, if you want single-factor authentication when you want to move money online, you get up to a certain amount. But if you want two-factor, you have to go to a certain amount after that. We're probably all familiar with that with one of the banks we deal with. Is that an insidious thing or practice, or is that something that actually would have a positive benefit to get people to move to the... In other words, we'll let you start here because you'll get that. But if you do this as well, two-factor authentication, you also get a higher level. Or do you guys see that as more of creating a second-class citizen type of world?
I think it's a great question. I'll open it up to the panel.
Yeah, I think that there's a minimum threshold for what is acceptable level of security. In my humble opinion, username, password, or username PIN is not a minimal acceptable level anymore. So then you go to the next stage, which is, okay, well, what do I need to add to make that minimal acceptable? I'm a big proponent of dynamic elevation of whether it's identity itself or whether it's based on the transaction that you're trying to do. So your bank example is a good one. If I want to log in to see my account balance, that's one level of security. If I attempt to transfer less than 3% of my balance, which in my case is probably $3, then that's another level of transaction. But if I want to dump 90% of my funds into someone else, well, that's the highest level, and it throttles up and down based on what you're trying to do. Also, the more information that we can gather about that transaction to strengthen it to whatever the required level is, the better that is, right? Based on the threat landscape, based on the attacks that are out there. So I'm a big proponent also of, identity proofing or verification isn't a one-time event. It's ongoing, because just because I identity proofed myself 6 months ago doesn't mean that someone somewhere hasn't stolen my identity and now is trying to use that same identity someplace else. So you've got the verification piece, but the authentication piece is important. And in order to strongly authenticate, you've got to tie in a lot of information. Certainly multi-factor authentication is the first step, but if there's other inputs that we can utilize at ID.me as an example, or any identity provider that can just give that confidence score higher based on the transaction, and that's goodness.
For the record, we paid Tracy more than $3.
Well, they pay me more, but I spend it all, so that's
So a
Have
non
it on record.
I'd offer a little different perspective. I think what you're talking about, there's a great role here for consumer advocacy organizations. This is, AARP exists because there were second-class citizens for healthcare, for health insurance, and that's why we came into being. I think the things you're talking about, there is definitely a role there for consumer advocacy organizations of all types to say this market needs to serve everybody. So I do think there are some cases where you have rights versus privileges, and especially I think you're talking mostly about privileges in society. And I think that there is definitely a role for I'm not just saying us, I'm just saying for people to band together and say, hey, we are millions and millions of people here, and we demand and we should have the same kind of services these other people are getting.
Thanks.
Yep. Well, we're at time right now. I will take one more question if there is one, but if not, we will wrap. Does anybody else have? All right. Well, thank you very much to all the panelists today for a great conversation, and to all of you.